in way of introduction to this story, I just want to say that that this story has come to us through the efforts of a man named Seamus McManus. And Seamus McManus was known by some folks as the last of the Irish, of the Shanachis, the great Irish story carriers. And Seamus McManus knew a lot of stories. He was a writer and a poet, and he wrote down a lot of the stories and recorded and dictated them, and was a great advocate for them. But he also stated and stated quite rightly that the stories weren't meant to be read. They were meant to be spoken and to be told, and he's absolutely right. Seamus McManus was absolutely correct that the stories are meant to be not to be sitting on a cold, dry page, but to be carried in the moist breath of a human being, and they're meant to be planted in the heart of a listener and to echo in the halls of the houses of our souls. So I want to give thanks to Seamus McManus for saving this story so it wouldn't be lost, for putting it into the seed of written word, and we'll ask his blessing on us now as the hobbled-tongued storytellers, me and Ben, try to do our best with what he left us. Interesting side note, Seamus McManus died in the year 1960 at the age of 92 when he fell out the 7th-story window of the nursing home. So I don't know, like why after 92 years he suddenly fell out of a window, but it might be that he checked out of the nursing home on his own terms. I don't know, but anyway, hopefully Seamus McManus wasn't the last of the Shanachis, and maybe one of your grandchildren or great grandchildren will be the next Shanachie carrying stories. We'll see what happens. We'll plant this seed of this story. This story is called The Snow, the Crow, and the Blood. So long ago, there was a king of a certain area in Ireland, and that king had a son named Jack. Jack was a young man, and he decided one day that he'd like to go hunting. Now, it was in the depths of winter, much like it is right here in Minnesota, and snow lay heavy on the ground. And Jack went out in the morning, and he took with him his bow and his arrows and some bird bolts. And he went out hunting, but he didn't find much. The only thing he saw to shoot at was a crow sitting on a branch. And he knocked an arrow, and he drew back his bow, and he shot that crow. Jack was a good shot, and he hit the crow, and it fell down. And he went over to retrieve his kill. But when he came to the kill, a strange thing happened. He looked down at the sight of that dead crow lying on the white snow, with its drops of blood staining the snow, and he was arrested by that scene. He looked at the black of the crow against the white of the snow and the drops of red blood, and he stared at the black and the white and the red for a long, long while. And it occurred to Jack, looking at that he would marry only a woman whose hair was as black as the feathers of the crow, whose skin was as white as new-fallen snow, and whose cheeks and lips were as red as the blood there on the snow. He vowed to himself that that was the woman he would marry. And he went home, And he told his parents that he intended to go out in the world and seek a wife, a woman whose hair was as black as the feathers of the crow, whose skin was as white as new fallen snow, and whose cheeks and lips were as red as blood. And his parents said, "Where will you ever find such a woman?" They tried to dissuade him. They tried to tell him to marry a nice local girl. But eventually Jack wore them down, and they gave their blessing that he should go out and seek this bride. And when Jack went out, his father, as he was leaving, as my father did when I would leave for college, his father slipped him 100 guineas, slipped him some money. Maybe some of your fathers have done that for you, or maybe some of you have done that for your sons. When they leave home, you slip them a little money. Money is a kind of protection for a son, but it's also an insulator from the world. Nevertheless, Jack took the money and he went out, setting out on his journey to find some woman who met that criteria: hair as black as the feathers of a crow, skin as white as snow, lips and cheeks as red as blood. The only problem was he didn't know where he would find her, and he didn't know what direction to go in. So he wandered about, picking some direction, I suppose. On the second day of his journey, in the morning, he came upon a strange scene, though. He was passing a cemetery, a graveyard, and there in the graveyard, there was a fresh grave dug, and there was a body wrapped in its shroud, and there were the family of the deceased, and there were some other people, and they were arguing. And Jack went over to see what the issue was. He went over and he asked somebody in the crowd what the situation was, why the argument. And he learned that the deceased, the dead man, had owed some money, and bailiffs had come to the graveyard and they had seized the corpse, they had seized the body, and they wouldn't allow it to be buried until the dead man's debts were paid. And of course, the family and friends of the deceased were outraged at this, as well they should be, and it was nearly about to come to blows. When Jack spoke up and he said, "Well, how much does the dead man owe?" And the bailiffs told him he owes 100 guineas. And without saying another word, Jack pulled out his purse, paid the debt, and walked off, leaving the man to be buried properly. Well, he traveled throughout that day, and in the afternoon, it so happened that on the road he encountered a little red man, a wee red man, and they fell in together, walking together. And they started making conversation, as you do with a fellow traveler. And eventually the little red man said, "Well, now, where are you going?" And Jack said, "Well, I'm going in search of a wife." "Oh," said the little red man, "well, that should be no trouble. For a fine, strong, large, handsome fellow like yourself, surely there'd be lots of girls willing to marry such a one as you." And Jack said, "Well, I've made a vow that I'll only marry a woman whose hair is as black as the feathers of a crow, whose skin is as white as new fallen snow, and whose cheeks and lips are as red as blood." And the little man, without batting an eye, said, "Oh, well then, there's only one woman in the world for you. She's the Princess of the East. And if you'd like, I can take you to her. And in fact, if you're going to woo a princess, you should have some kind of retinue. And if you'd like, I'll be your boy," said the little red man. "I'll be your boy." And Jack said, "That would be wonderful, but I have to tell you, I've no money to pay you." "Ah," said the little red man, "never mind about that." And off they went together, heading now toward the east. toward the land where the sun rises up out of the sea, the kingdom of the princess of the east. Near nightfall, they started to look for a place to stay. And the little red man said, "I know just the place for us tonight." And he led Jack to a dark, large, foreboding castle. And Jack said, "Oh, what castle is this?" And the little red man said, "This is the castle of the giant of the cloak of darkness." "Oh," said Jack, I've heard of that giant. It's a terrible thing. Well, surely we'll not stay here." "Aye," said the little red man, "we'll stay here and nowhere else." And immediately the little red man began to pound on the door of the castle and to rouse the giant of the cloak of darkness, to ask for hospitality. All Jack's instincts told him to run, but he didn't want to make himself out a coward in front of the little red man. And so he held his ground, and he heard giant footsteps from the other side of the door approaching. And he wondered what terrible thing might be that would open that door. And that's where we will leave him for tonight.
Here we are. So we come back into this story time, into this area, this place, this organizing location within ourselves, where we move into the imagination, we move into a different realm, we move into a different world. We move back into story time. And we let our bodies remember. And we remember that we had met a young man named Jack who went hunting. And in his hunting, he killed a crow. And that image arrested him as he saw the white, the black, and the red. The pure white of the snow, the black of the crow's wing, and the red of the blood. And it occasioned a desire in his heart to go in search of a woman who had hair as black as those crow wings, skin as white as the snow, and lips and cheeks as red as that blood. And undeterred in the immensity of such a journey, he went anyway with the blessing of his father and mother, with 100 guineas in his pocket. And along that journey, he came across a funeral. And at that funeral, with the debt owed that he paid, and he continued. And if you remember, he met a strange little red man who offered to be his boy free of charge. And I know that some of us had that question in our mind, is anything free? And they came in their journeys, finally, to a great castle with dark doors, maybe overgrown on the edges. And Jack asked the little red man where this castle was. Whose castle was this? And the little red man said, "This is the castle of the giant of the cloak of darkness." And Jack answered, "I've heard of this place. Let's stay somewhere else." And the little red man said, "I shall not be afraid. Never have been afraid in my life. We're going to stay here tonight." And Jack, unwilling to let himself be swayed by the fear that was in his knees, stood and agreed. And the little red man reached up, grabbed hold of that big knocker on the front of the door and banged on it. And it resonated through a big, dark castle. And inside they could hear a rustling. And that rustling came about closer and closer, and they could hear the chuffing of something big moving. And the doors rattled as they opened. And there stood before them a fearsome giant. And the giant looked down at them, these two small beings, little red man and this, well, not much more than a boy. And he said, "What do you want?" And the little red man said, "We want what every traveler wants. We would like to have a nice meal and a place to sleep." The giant contemplated for a moment, and then a chuckle rose up inside of him. "That's exactly what I would like too. And I think I shall have you for a meal and sleep comfortably on your bones." And the little red man leapt up, pulled out a sword, brandished it. And the giant, with speed unsuspected in something so large, whipped out his sword, and the two of them went at it. And the clash and clang of their swords beating against each other and the speed at which they spun back and forth belied anything that we could imagine, until finally, in a moment, a parry, the little red man thrust his sword into the giant's heart, dropping him right there on the spot. And the little red man looked up at Jack, sheathed his sword, and said, "Let's eat." And together they went inside the castle. They had themselves a fine meal, and they slept in a soft bed. And in the morning, the wee red man took the cloak of darkness that the giant had in his back room, and together they began their journey again. And so they went for a long time down the road. And they passed different things. They saw different things on their way, until finally, as night grew close and hunger began to take over, they came to another castle. Jack, realizing that this young, strange creature was leading him, they came to this castle, and Jack, with a little question in his mind, asked, "Where are we now?" And the wee red man with a big smile on his face says, "We are at the castle of the giant of the purse of plenty." And Jack says, "I've heard of this one. Can we just choose to go someplace else?" And the wee red man looked up into him and says, "I have never made a choice based on fear in this life, and I'm not going to start today. We're staying here for the night." And with that, he grabbed hold of the chains of the gate and he gave him a big rattle, and the rattle boomed through the dark castle. And inside, they heard the rustling and the scraping of something big. And finally, the doors opened, and there stood a giant, hideous, two-headed giant. And with a semi-toothed grin, the giant's two heads looked down and said, "What do you want?" And the little red man says, "We want what every traveler wants. We would like to have a nice board and a nice bed, something to break up our journey." And the giant looked down and he grumbled and he smiled and he chuckled. Now a chuckle that stood the hair on Jack's head straight up, weakened his knees. And the giant said, "Well, that sounds exactly what I would like to. And I think I shall dine finely on your flesh and sleep comfortably on your bones." And with that, once again, the swords came out, and the clashing and the hewing and the hacking went back and forth, and the two danced back and forth in front of the castle, until finally the wee red man's speed overcame the giant's power, and in went the sword through his heart, taking him down, killing him in an instant. And together the two of them went inside and had a lovely meal and slept in soft feather beds. And in the morning, the two of them gathered up the purse of plenty, enough food to last the day, and they began their journey once again. And so it was that they traveled for a long time, and this time into a strange land, and the land grew darker, more wild, until finally they came to a castle, and this castle was large. The walls were imposing. And Jack, with that sinking sentiment in his heart, asked the wee red man, "Where are we now?" And the wee red man, with a smile on his face, "We are at the castle of the giant of the sword of light." And Jack's knees nearly buckled, for he had heard of this giant. And he says, "Please, let's go to a different neighborhood than this one. We do not want to stay here." And the wee red man says, "In no point have I ever made a decision based on the fear of anything mortal in this world." And with that, he banged on the door. And inside there was a chuffing and a scraping and a banging until finally the doors were swung wide open, and there stood a hideous, horrendous, three-headed giant. And the giant grumbled down in a gravelly voice and says, "What was it that you want?" And the wee red man, in a bright voice, says, "We want what every traveler wants. We would like to have a lovely meal and a soft place to sleep for the night on our journey." And the giant turned to him and said, "Well, I want the same thing. And I think I shall have you for a meal. And then I shall sleep comfortably on your bones." And with that, he pulled out the sword of light. Now, the sword of light was not made anywhere in this world. And when it was drawn, it set up a shock, a crack, a sound that went all the way around the entire world and came back to them. And the wee red man pulled out his sword. But before he did, he pulled out the cloak of darkness, wrapped it around him so the giant could not see him. And the giant began to swing, seeing that the wee red man had disappeared. He swung this way, he swung that way, and the wee red man, invisible to the giant, leapt back and forth, hewing and hacking and drawing blood and cuts on the giant, until finally, at a moment when the giant was confused, he reached in and he thrust his sword deep into the giant's heart and dropped him right there on the spot. And picking up the sword, he put it inside of his bag, and together they went inside and they had a meal that only kings and queens could imagine. Fine wine, good food. And when they had their full, they went and slept in lovely, soft feather beds. In the morning, they took off once again, and they traveled for a long time. And as they traveled, they did well, for they had the purse of plenty, which they gave them everything that they needed. So they went until finally they neared the castle, the lands of the princess of the East. And bringing their stallions, for they had gathered stallions along the way, big, fine horses, they went to a place, a blacksmith, and they had the blacksmith shoe the horses with gold. And when they neared the castle, they did not even bother with the doors. They simply drove their horses forward and leapt over the walls and into the courtyard of the castle. And there, the people and the soldiers gathered all of a sudden, for this was quite an apparition. These two amazing beings, this young, beautiful man and this wee red strange man on the backs of horses with gold on their hooves. And as they gathered near, Jack and the wee red man began to throw gold and silver out of the purse of plenty. And the people were amazed. And finally, one of the courtiers went inside and went to the princess of the East and told her that there were two beautiful men in the courtyard asking to see her. And so she said, "Bring them. Let me see who these two are." And so they were brought in the front of the princess of the East, and she stood and looked at them. Now, given the entry, you would think that she would have a kind eye. Well, how many of us have received that eye from somebody that was as beautiful as this woman was reported to be? It was a steely look. But for Jack, on his part, he took in this visage, the black hair, the white skin, the red of the lips, and he remembered what had brought him on this journey, and he was taken by her beauty and her spirit too. And she said to him, "Why is it that you've come to see me?" And Jack said, "I've come to court you." And she says, "Well, many have come to court me, and none have been able to complete the 3 tasks that are necessary to gain my hand. And should you not complete the 3 tasks fully and completely and as they are given, then your head shall be mine. Will you agree?" And Jack, maybe foolishly, said, "I'll agree," because all he could see was her beauty. And so she took him into a garden, the Garden of Heads. And there, inside this great garden, was a gathering of 365 rose bushes. And on 364 of the rose bushes, there were the heads of the previous suitors. And she looked at Jack and she said to him, "Do you notice the one rose bush there at the end with no head? It is my belief and my hope that I will be able to put the flower of your head on that rose bush in 3 days' time." And with that, she sent Jack and the wee red man off to await dinner. And there is where we shall leave us for the rest of the afternoon until we come back. Well, here we go. So there Jack stood, looking at the princess, this woman that he found himself enraptured with, and at the same time terrified. And Jack held his breath for just a moment, nodding as he was looking at that garden with 364 heads and 365 bushes, with one waiting just for him. That evening, the princess invited Jack for dinner, and they had a nice meal, a little bit of wine, and some pleasant conversation. There was, you can imagine, a little bit of tension. And at the end of the meal, she stood to say goodnight, and she looked down at him. And she took the comb, a gold comb, out of her hair, and she said, "This night, between the hours of midnight and when the cock crows, I will not be on this earth, nor beneath this earth. But somehow you must take this comb from my hair and give it to me in the morning." And with that, she stood and she left. And Jack sat there and watched her leave the room with his jaw hanging open, realizing that he had just bought himself something that he didn't think that he could do. And so when he left that table, he wandered out to the garden and he sat on a bench. He put his hands slowly up to his face and then dipped his head down, resting his elbows on the floor, or on his knees. Felt like the floor. And he said to himself, "There's no way. Not of this earth, not beneath this earth." And as he sat there, the little red man came out to the garden to see what was going on and stood next to him. And he asked him, "So, Jack, what goes it with you? How goes things?" And Jack looked up at the little red man and explained everything that had just happened. What his task was to find somehow between the hours of midnight and when the cock crows, to find this woman, steal the golden comb from her hair when she would not be on this earth nor beneath this earth. And he put his face back into his hands. And the wee red man said to him, well, let me see what I can do. And with that, he left. And he went back to his room, and the wee red man found his cloak of darkness, wrapped it around himself, and he went up and he sat in the hallway to the chambers of the princess. And just a moment before midnight, just before the bell rang, she opened the door and came out and walked down the hall and out of the castle, and she walked up to the gateway between this world and the other world, and she went through. And the wee red man, wrapped in his cloak of darkness, followed her. And into the other world they went, and she went to a place, a beautiful place, a garden, rich with flowers and amazing, gorgeous beauty everywhere. And there on a bench waiting for her was the king of the other world. And she sat down next to him, and they began to chat. And they began to laugh. And the wee little red man crept up behind her. And at a moment when neither was paying much attention, he reached up and snatched the gold comb and raced back to this world. And once he was back in this world, he found Jack, and he presented him with the golden comb. And in the morning, breakfast was served. Jack sat down at the table, and the princess, she walked in, and she was furious. Fire flew from her eyes, and she sat down with a thin-lipped look as Jack presented her with the golden comb. She said nothing, but stood and went out of the room. And so it was for the day. Jack wandered the area, wandered the castle, and in the evening when dinner was called, she was there, pleasant. They chatted for a little bit, and as dinner closed, she lifted up her hand, and on her hand was a diamond ring. And she said to him, she said, I will not be on this earth, nor beneath this earth, between the hours of midnight and when the cock crows. And during that time, you must obtain this diamond ring. And with that, she stood and she left. And a cold washed over Jack as he realized this was a task that was way beyond him. And so he wandered outside, found a bench, put his face into his hands, and sobbed, realizing this would be possibly the end of his life, and his head would be forfeit. And the wee red man, well, he found his way to Jack, stood next to him, rubbed his shoulder and said, Jack, how goes it with you? And Jack looked up and explained everything that had been said. And the wee red man says, well, maybe there's something I can do. And with that, he leaves. And he goes to the hallway where the princess lives, and he wraps the cloak of darkness around him so he's invisible. And just before the strike of midnight, she creeps out the door, goes out the castle, and the wee red man follows her. And when she enters into the other world, she goes and she finds the king of the other world, and together they embrace and they sit and they talk. And the wee red man, invisible as he was, he sneaks up next to her. And at a moment where her hand is outstretched in conversation, he reaches up and he plucks the diamond ring right off of her finger and races back to this world. He comes and he finds Jack and he presents him with the diamond ring. And in the morning, when she arrives at the breakfast table, she is doubly enraged. Her breath is coming out in puffs. Her lips are stretched thin, blood red, seeming to leak right on out. Her eyes are on fire, and her hair glistens in the light. And Jack slides the diamond ring across the table to her, and she takes it. And then she looks at him, And she says, tonight, between the hours of midnight and when the cock crows, I will not be on this earth nor beneath this earth. But during that time, you must cut the lips of he who is kissing me. And I can tell you this, there is no blade made on this world that can pierce that skin. And with that, she turns and she leaves. And that evening, when Jack is sitting, heart frozen in his chest, realizing not even the wee red man has the wherewithal to be able to do such a task, sits in the garden. He can't even weep. And the wee red man comes up to him and shrugs him on the shoulder and says, how goes it with you, Jack? And Jack explains everything that he's been told. And he says to him, I was told even a blade from this world cannot touch that skin. And the wee red man turns and pulls out the sword of light. He doesn't unsheath it, but he pulls it out. And he says to him, this blade was never made on this world. And with that, he leaves, goes back to the hallway. He wraps himself in the cloak of darkness. And just before the stroke of midnight, the princess creeps out of her room, goes down the hall, and then finds her way to the gateway to the other world. And the wee red man follows her. And when she goes through, she's followed by the wee red man, and she finds her way to the king of the other world. And when he stands to embrace her, they reach their faces towards each other. And just as he's kissing her, the wee red man pulls out the sword of light, drops that blade perfectly between them, taking the lips from the king of the other world, snatching them up, and races back to this world, finds Jack and presents him in a silken cloth, the lips of the king of the other world. And in the morning, she comes through to the breakfast table. Her whole body is shaking with rage. And Jack slides the lips wrapped in a silk cloth across the table to her and says to her, the agreement is complete. We must be wed. And even though she was enraged, a wedding occurred. And so it was that when the wedding was complete, there was feasting. There was great partying. But the princess, well, let's just leave it that she had her reservations. And as they were preparing to leave to return to Jack's kingdom, the wee red man comes to him and says, I have a present for you, a gift for your wedding. And he hands Jack 10 blackthorn branches full of sloe berries and razor sharp thorns. And he says to him, each morning, before you begin your day's journey, you and the princess must pluck the sloe berries from this branch, and they must pick away each of the thorns together. And when you are complete, take that blackthorn branch, and with your hands on it, stick it into the ground before you leave. And in this way, you will learn to be man and wife, partners, knowing what each other's gifts are for this world. And so it was, they began their journey, and each morning, a sloe berry branch was brought out, blackthorn branches, thorns, berries. The berries were plucked and planted. The thorns were plucked off of each of the branches, leaving blood on each one. And every morning they stuck that branch into the ground before their journey began. And on the 10th day, after they had completed, they had a kind of marriage that we could only wish for. And on that 10th day, the wee red man came to Jack and he said to him, do you remember the beginning of our journey? And do you remember that corpse whose debt was not paid? And Jack said he did. And the wee red man says, I was that corpse, and you paid my debt, and now your debt to me is paid. And with that, the wee red man went his way, and Jack and the princess went their way. And so it comes that they spent their life together, taking the good with the bad, as all of us do. And that's the story that I have for you today.